Hi, I'm Chris Castile, political reporter with the Oklahoman. Thanks so much for joining us. Today we have the privilege of having Congressman Tom Cole in with us here in Oklahoma City. He's had a very busy week, even though Congress is in recess. He has not been. He has been all over the 4th District. I saw you in Ada and Ardmore town halls on Monday. Those were both fascinating. Your district is so vast, like some of the Oklahoma districts. I mean, sitting here in downtown, we're not far from it. I mean, you've got, actually you have some parts of Oklahoma City.
I do.
But you do have Tinker Air Force Base. You have 2 huge military installations, Tinker Air Force Base, Fort Sill. Tell us about your district.
Well,
it's an interesting
of course,
district.
you've got those 2 anchoring it at each end. You've got 20,000 producing oil and gas wells, so it's an energy district. You've got 13 to 14,000 farms and ranches, so it's an ag district. It's number 7 in the country in terms of the number of horses per capita. It produces more tires than any congressional district in America because of the Goodyear facility in Lawton and the Michelin facility in Ardmore. It's got 5 different colleges and universities, everything from the flagship university at the University of Oklahoma to USAO in Chickasha and East Central in Ada, Rose State, and then East Central over and I mentioned that, but in Cameron and Lawton. It's got 11 different Indian tribes have jurisdictions over parts of it. So it's
one of which you're a member of.
I'm very proud Chickasaw, and it's the largest tribe in the district actually. So again, quite diverse, and because of that, you have to be interested and involved in quite a few things. National Severe Storm Laboratory in Norman, EPA groundwater research center in Ada, the Kerr Lab. So again, very diverse, big federal presence.
Let's talk about the town halls. They were fascinating, both on one in Ada at a beautiful the McSwain Theater that has been renovated, the other at the Ardmore Convention Center. People are interested in a variety of things. A lot of people seem to be paying very close attention. There's a lot of interest in immigration. There's a lot of interest in some of the new Democrats in Washington. Tell us a little about, you've been doing town halls. You were first elected in 2002, but I mean, you've been part of the political life in Oklahoma for long before that. Tell me first about town halls. I mean, why they're important, what you and the people who attend them get out of them.
Well, you know, Lincoln used to meet, even in the heights of Civil War, every Wednesday he would have like an hour or 2 at the White House that literally anybody could come. And he used to call them his public opinion baths. And the town hall's a little bit like that. You know, you can read all the numbers you want, but there's nothing that replaces talking to constituents and getting a sense of what's on their mind, what kind of questions that they want to pose, frankly, how intense they are in either an opinion. Is it a question? Is it a comment? I think Oklahomans like their members to be accessible in that way. They know they can get an appointment and come in and see you, but they want you to be out there and available to all comers. And frankly, some of the judgment they make is how you respond to people, not that just agree with you, but that disagree with you. And do you give them a fair hearing? And are you willing to engage in them? I think they judge you as a person as much as they judge where you're at on the issues in a town hall. And it gives them their chance to do that. And it, you know, they like to remind you who the boss is, and it's them. And, you know, you work for them. And so it's your obligation to come to them in their communities and be available to be questioned by them on a pretty regular basis. I'm pretty proud most of my colleagues in Oklahoma do that. I mean, we're, you know, any year you want to look, most Oklahoma members do more town halls than the average member in other parts of the country.
You were on your feet for like 2 hours at each of them.
Those were pretty short, actually.
But yeah, I mean, they kept you busy answering questions. And I should say that there wasn't one that you didn't answer in great detail and with some perspective. The answer to, you know, the woman who was so upset about socialism, and your reminder to her that, you know, the young people have always been. I was just reading those comments again today, but tell me what you told her about the young people that you come across. Well, she's worried about all the young people that are following Bernie Sanders.
I'm very optimistic. Look, I probably see more young people than anybody other than university professors and classroom teachers, because we always have youth groups coming up to Washington. I've got a young staff, we have interns, I've got all these colleges and universities. I go to high schools and junior highs as well. And obviously, if you're on the Armed Services Committee, you travel, you see young Americans in really challenging places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So I have a lot of faith in them. I mean, I think they're an extraordinary group. Honestly, I compare them to the baby boomer generation that I'm part of. I think they're better educated. I think, frankly, they're more civil and tolerant. I think they've got a high civic commitment, if you will. So I'm pretty impressed with the next generation of Americans, and I think this country's going to do exceptionally well. And I think if more people my age, or that are sort of on the other side of 50, had an opportunity to interact more with these young people, they'd be pretty impressed too.
Well, the concern that some of the people were expressing, at least in Ada, and at least I think from one questioner in Ardmore, about socialism in the United States. So what do you?
You may remember the last guy in that is a business guy in Ada, and he's a developer. He builds houses and stuff like that. And he had actually mentioned he had a couple of kids or grandkids that were Bernie Sanders supporters, and when somebody expressed that, he sort of spontaneously said, well, I know what's going to fix that. I mean, they're going to get out in the economy, and they're going to see how many taxes are coming out of their paycheck. And hey, don't worry, the economy will bring them back. And look, I don't know. I can't predict the future on that. It's not unusual to old Winston Churchill saying the person who's not liberal when they're 20 has no heart. The person who's not conservative when they're 40 has no head. And he actually passed the gamut himself that way. But I think, look, experience is a powerful teacher, and there's some reasons I think why younger people today are more prone to collective action. Everything from college debt to, having come in many cases to political consciousness during the middle of the Great Recession, which is really, next to the Great Depression, the most searing economic experience of the 20th and 21st century is really just a few years ago. And a lot of kids, saw their families lose houses, saw their parents lose jobs and retirement checks, saw themselves, their own prospects shrink pretty dramatically from what they thought they were going to be. That'll have a big impact on a generation. But I think in the end, look, we're a democracy in the best sense of the word. The institutions of the country are incredibly strong and have served us very, very well. And just, trust the American people. Over time, they tend to get the right answer.
You spoke in detail about kind of this whole process about the emergency declaration for border security, the bill to rescind that declaration, the veto of that bill, and when you guys go back next week, I think maybe even Tuesday,
26.
You'll vote on whether to override the president's veto. And you told the audiences in Ada and Ardmore, you think this is going to wind up in the courts?
I think without a doubt. Look, it's a legitimate constitutional question here. There are people that agree with the president on the problem and have been supportive up to this point, but think this is now separation of power issues. And so you saw, particularly in the Senate, but some of my colleagues in the House as well, change their mind. I look at it, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I look at the 1976 Act in which Congress gave the president the power to declare a national emergency. It's happened almost 60 times since then. This is the first one that's ever been challenged on constitutional grounds. It's also, though, the first time Congress has voted to override a declaration. But I think the courts tend to be pretty careful. They don't want to be the ones deciding national emergencies. And if you have operated by the law, I think what the Roberts Court would tend to tell you is, well, if you think it's wrong, go change the law. And there's actually a lot of sentiment to do that. I would not be surprised to see an effort to actually amend the law.
Right, there's talk of that.
Yeah, and pretty serious discussion. And from some of the most conservative quarters that are supporting the president in this, but actually have come to the conclusion we maybe gave too much power away. So now, again, these pushes and pulls between the executive and the legislative branch are as old as the republic itself.
Sure.
And so I know a lot of people think we've given up a lot, and I think we've given up too much. I've been very active over the years in efforts to get a new what's called AUF, authorization for the use of military force,
yes,
because I do think we've abandoned war-making power to the president, be it Democrat or Republican, way too much. I've actually worked with very liberal Democrats on that issue. I think this is probably another manifestation of it, but I have to judge it on the two bases. Number one, is there an emergency on the border? In my opinion, almost $70 billion worth of illegal drugs, according to the estimates we have, coming across the border. Literally thousands of people caught up in human trafficking, victims of sexual exploitation. 76,000 people last month that we apprehended, others that obviously we didn't because we don't get everybody. I call that a crisis, and it's getting worse, not better. And we've had two crises on the southern border declared by President Obama. One related to drug cartels. We know that's a crisis. The other one was actually another one of these unaccompanied children surges in 2014, where Congress then gave him what he asked for, which is about $3.7 or $9 billion.
This is where a lot of them wound up living in Fort Sill.
Fort Sill, we had 1,200 or so. So to me, I think this is the same thing. And I don't see the president acting unusually, and I also give the president more credit than his critics do for him trying to avoid this. You know, he started telling us in December when we first passed through the House money for border security, and then the Senate we had the majority, but we couldn't get to 60, so it's Senate rules that stopped us, not them having the majority. And the president said, look, my lawyers tell me I can do this. I'd rather negotiate with you. That would be better. And he offered to split the difference in terms of money, something that people forget. And the response was no. And then during the government shutdown period, he said, well, last year you were willing to spend $25 billion for legal status for what are called DACA kids, deferred action childhood arrivals. That is, we don't consider a child a criminal because a parent brought them. They're a minor, just like a minor in any other criminal situation. They're not responsible. So he said, how about I give you 3 years guaranteed legal status for these young people, and we'll continue to work on what the final solution should be in exchange for didn't get anything. Then he unconditionally reopened the government, said I'll sign a 3-week continuing resolution. You guys try and negotiate something. And we did, and we got him something. We got him $1.4 billion toward the wall when Speaker Pelosi had said not a dollar, or actually $1 to be fair to her. And he said, great, I'll take it, I'll sign it, I'll reopen the government, but I am going to declare the national emergency and proceed from there. So the president has signaled this all along. And Democrats either wanted to have this kind of a showdown politically, or they didn't take him at his word. And so again, we'll go to the courts. There'll be plenty of suits once the legislative process exhausts itself, that is, the override does not succeed. That's the appropriate point. Somebody wants to challenge. But in the interim, between the money he already has, and I think the money that nobody contests he could take, like drug interdiction money and redeploy, that wall or those physical barriers will start being built. You know, I'd say the president's, like all presidents, he's going to test the limits of executive authority. But again, that's not new in American history. That's pretty traditional.
Just real quick on the money. I mean, do you expect that any military construction projects anywhere will actually get tapped for
no,
this?
I think some may be delayed because the Pentagon will come right back the next year. And you have to remember, we all think in terms of the calendar year, but the government operates by the fiscal year. That's September 30th. We're going to be right up against that. And so by the time you appropriate the money, then they've got to let the projects, they've got a bidding process. So I really think in the end, anything that needs to get built is going to get built. And I certainly don't think anything here in Oklahoma is in any real danger at all.
This isn't your first time in the minority, but you spent
I don't like it.
I'm sure. You spent most of your time in the majority, but there is some question, especially since there's a presidential race already going on that will consume probably Washington next year. Some question about what this divided Congress can get done. You And I think every other member of the delegation I saw this week, Senator Inhofe, Congresswoman Horn, and Congressman Lucas mentioned a big infrastructure bill is a possibility.
It's a possibility, but the longer we go, the less likely it becomes, because you slip into an election year. And I think a real infrastructure bill probably would call for some sort of tax increase, probably a gasoline tax increase. If you were going to do it, now's the time to do it. Gasoline prices are lower than they've been in quite some time, and it looks like they're going to stay that way for a while. So, you know, I think it's something we'd look at as part of a total package, but the politics make it more and more difficult. And, you know, while Congress can do multiple things at once, boy, the sheer scope of the investigations Democrats have launched where the president is concerned, number one, are going to consume a lot of legislative energy, and number two, are going to create a lot of ill will on both sides. You know, the reality is when you're fighting, it's harder to legislate in a cooperative way. So,
and you
not
made
impossible.
the point this week that all these U.S. senators that are running for president, Democratic U.S. senators, aren't going to want to agree with the president on anything.
That's right, and we have a couple House members too. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard is off running, so we've got. But yeah, once they're running, there's two things, and the senators are really critical in this because that body is so much smaller, and individual senators have so much more power. But the reality is, number one, they're not there to do their job. If you're running for president, it's a big country. You're out, you're going to miss a lot of votes. Number two, you're not inclined to compromise with the person that you're running against. And particularly in the Democratic primaries, you know, it's going to be sort of who can vilify the president the most, I think. So I just think those things complicate. Again, that's nobody's fault. The election just happens when it happens, but it makes it much, much more difficult. And finally, you know, to get anything done, and I've talked very candidly with my Democratic colleagues, many of whom are old friends, you know, guys, in the end, you got to compromise. You're like, we were in exactly the same spot in 2011. We won a majority. We were a very energetic majority, but the Democrats held the Senate, and Barack Obama was president. So anything that's going to happen is going to be a compromise. And if you can't compromise, and it's very hard, particularly for freshman members, they've run, you know, they've just gotten there, they're certain they're going to be able to change the world pretty quickly, and then they run into the Constitution of the United States, which spreads out and divides powers in ways that force you to compromise and work together, particularly in divided government.
Back to the, you know, a lot of people, I think, probably expected when the Democrats won the majority that there would be some move towards impeachment. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said in an interview with the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, we're not going to do that. I mean, he's not worth it. And there seemed to be, even before she said that, some sense that it would be better to beat him at the ballot box. But were you surprised at all?
I really wasn't. I think, number one, she's giving her members really good political advice. You know, so if you impeached him, so what? I mean, you've got 47 Democratic senators. You've got to get to 67 in the United States. Give me the list of the 20 Republicans you think would vote with you. And so, as she said, and she was careful, she said, it's got to be bipartisan. There's going to be something so obvious. So I think, number one, she doesn't want to waste her time members. Number two, I think she knows her most vulnerable members are not the ones we're seeing and hearing from the most. They're the ones that are holding Trump seats. And there's 31 of them, and a movement to impeach the president in places that he carried last time and may well carry again would put her majority in danger. I think third, honestly, I think she thinks it would be easier to defeat you know, Trump than it would to be a new person who had come in and was sort of in a healing mode. I've often speculated that had Bill Clinton resigned, or had the Republicans been successful in removing him, I think Al Gore would have won the election in 2000.
He would have been the sitting president.
Sitting president of the United States. He would have guided us through a crisis. He would have, you know, said some healing and wonderful things.
Although that didn't help Gerald Ford in 1976.
No, but it turned into a lot closer election than anybody thought it was going to be. And in his case, he pardoned, you know, Richard Nixon, and that's what put him in the hole, and he still nearly pulled it out.
Well, let me say, and I know we're still, as close as it might seem, very far. Anything could happen in this presidential race. But what do you think now of Trump's reelection chance? If you were assessing it today in March of 2019.
I think it will be very close. Look, I think The president has good things to run on. I actually think, and he got in a lot of trouble, but Speaker Ryan actually gave us a pretty good advice. If this is an election about the president's personality, he's going to be at risk. If it's about his accomplishments and what he wants to do going forward, he's in a much stronger position. I would still argue that that's the case. The country right now is at relative peace, really successful, coming off the elimination of the physical caliphate. I think military rebuilding, good position in the world, maybe close to a couple of big trade deals, we'll see. The economy right now is good, you never know. So those things all argue well. But look, President Trump is a very polarizing personality. That's just true. You know, he'll sometimes, I think, get off message. He's going to tell you what's on his mind, whether it's politically expedient to do that or not. I think a pretty good example was this recent, you know, dust-up we had over John McCain. Look, the president was on his way to Ohio to talk about job recovery and jobs and good stuff for him to talk about. Instead, the news cycle was dominated about you know, his differences with a man who is legitimately an American hero and has been dead for 7 months. So whether you're right or wrong in your judgment, you would say, why bring this into the conversation politically right now? So I think the president you know, is going to be polarizing. I don't think he's going to change at this point, and I don't think opinions are going to change. The real important thing for him is who comes out of the Democratic primary.
Right.
How divisive is this, or is he such a unifying figure for all Democrats that they'll come back together? And will voters that don't participate in the Democratic primary, what will they think of that nominee when they come out? So I expect a really bare-knuckled, hard-nosed campaign. It'll go right down to the wire again, but certainly no guarantee. This is not like watching Ronald Reagan. It's morning in America again in 1984. Even though you could argue the conditions in terms of the economy and some of the successes overseas, he ought to be able to run that kind of campaign, but his personality won't allow that to happen, and his political style won't allow that to happen.
You made the comment in Ardmore the other night, 2016, the country shifted to the right. 2018, the country shifted to the left. What does it do in 2020, do you think?
I don't think we know. You know, again, I think Democratic energy will be very high. We saw that in the midterms. But, you know, President Obama suffered a pretty staggering midterm loss, worse than President Trump, because he lost ground in both houses. And yet, and he came back and won comfortably, really, over Mitt Romney, who was a very good candidate. So I think, you know, the president, his fate is in his own hands, but also in the hands of Democratic primary voters. You know, my instinct is that the country is not going to run an ideological campaign in quite the same way it did in the midterms. It's going to look at, okay, do we want to keep what we've got because it's not likely that the president's going to change, or do I want something fundamentally different, and am I willing to run some risk in terms of the economy and you know, foreign affairs in order to do that? So I think that's an open judgment right now, open case. It really, campaigns do matter, events do occur that could, you know, God forbid that we would have a terrorist attack, but if something like that happened, how would that impact things? You don't know. I mean, it obviously, you know, because of the manner in which he handled it at the time, or was perceived to have handled it, helped George Bush a lot, didn't hurt him. In another case, it might be very, very different. So you just don't know.
You never know. That's what makes it so fascinating.
Well, they run campaigns for a reason. You know, if we could all pick it out of the hat, you know, and every prognosticator was right, Hillary Clinton would be president of the United States. Right. So it just goes to show. And, you know, if you go back to the Bush-Gore race in 2000, early on, the only people I know that really thought it was going to be close were those of us at the RNC. We predicted it would be close.
You were chief of staff.
I was chief of staff then, but most people, oh my gosh, because he had a huge lead, but our side came together early. Just we were ready to, and it took the Democrats a while to sort through it and get there. But at the end of the day, you know, it was a razor-thin contest. So
Very, very razor thin.
Yeah, and if you go back in '88, I was state chairman then, and we were in New Orleans, and we were trailing, Dukakis by 17 points, although it had already started to narrow, and we ended up winning by like 12 or something. I don't know, 8, I guess. But
let me ask you this, because I'm glad that you made me think of that. It was an interesting question in Ada, I think. I'll leave you with this, but the question about the popular vote in the Electoral College. Somebody was wondering, is there a chance at the Electoral College? You kind of told them what it would take just to get that on the ballot,
I think
and then through.
It's unlikely to be removed anytime soon. I mean, it takes a constitutional amendment,
right?
And so to get it on the ballot, you'd have to have 2/3 of both the House and the Senate agree. That's not there right now. And then 3/4 of the states would have to agree. And a lot of states like the Electoral College because it makes
small
them important.
Population ones.
Small population, or Florida. Florida, where everybody's going to go fight in Florida all the time, and they're not going to fight in California or New York because the outcome's preordained. I also think, though, conservatives quite often worry that, well, then we would never win. And they forget how many small states are not conservative states. Delaware, Vermont, they're not our states. They're, they overpunch too. And the campaign would be very different. Right now, we don't run campaigns in a number of the most populous states in the country, like New York and California.
Texas,
we really don't in Illinois.
Yeah.
We would. If the popular vote were in, I mean, we would have still lost California, but if Donald Trump would spend a lot more money and time in California. He probably didn't spend a dime on advertising out there. He would have been doing rallies. And so instead of losing by 4 million votes, maybe he'd have lost it by 2 million votes or something. So again, you can't predict, but if we, it's not going to change between now and the next presidential election, that's for sure. So if the next president wins and wants to change it, then that debate means something. But right now, and my experience is once they win, if they win under that system, they usually don't want to change it.
Right. Congressman, thanks so much for coming in. It's always fascinating to hear your observations.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And look for this and other stories on News OK and in the Oklahoman.